I'm really looking forward to this. It's really exciting. And so we have Michael Levin and Bonnitta Roy and Matt Segall and John Vervaeke will be helping me discuss this. I'm so excited for this for so many different reasons. Because, well, first, Bonnitta Roy has been influential in helping me see a lot of different things. I spent a lovely evening at her house. She's a deep and profound thinker who I can't spend enough time talking about the animal mind in terms of and its existence in relationship to what we need to do to get back in touch with nature. Matt Segall's work in relationship to the well, first off, Matt, you are everywhere, dude. I mean, you are really, and you're out there, shaking up the world in relationship to how we be thinking, and the way you're bringing back Whitehead and where you're clarifying. And I have to say, your little footnotes to Plato signal, I could have copied that from my UTOK book. I don't know if you see with the Tree of Life, and we should look at that one time. It's really beautiful. And then finally, Michael Levin, you revolutionized biology, dude. And it's amazing. And I was happy to send you a book and be able to give you my gratitude as a fellow scientist for what you're doing and the way you're doing it. I am deeply envious of your experimental chops and the number of the ways in which you are grabbing and transforming the way we're thinking about the world. And so kudos to you. So we'll get to see where each of these brilliant thinkers have to say in relationship to each other. And then we'll be able to, me and John will dance with that in relationship to extended naturalism. So we have 2 hours of joy in front of us. So I'm really excited about that. So with no further ado, we're going to kick it off with Michael Levin, and then Matt will go, and then Bonnitta will go, and then John and I will engage in some discussion in relation. Okay.
All right. Let's see. Can everybody see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Perfection. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here to talk to all of you. There's a fascinating set of topics. I'm very happy to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is some efforts that we and others have made to try to expand what I think of as significant mind blindness that affects us because of our evolutionary history and our focus on particular kinds of minds. And I'm going to spend the middle part of the talk discussing results that we have using the collective intelligence of body cells as a model system to understand a diverse intelligence that lives in a weird space that's hard for us to imagine, and the progress we've actually made in communicating with that intelligence. So it's kind of a case study for us. But I'm also going to talk about some much weirder things. If anybody's interested in the primary papers, the data sets, the software, everything is here. And then here's where I keep my own kind of personal thoughts about what it all means. So I want to start off by just reminding ourselves of something that happened over history, is that prior to having a solid theory of electromagnetism, we had static electricity, and we had lightning, and we had magnets, and we had light, and we all thought those were different things. Okay, we thought these were completely different kinds of phenomena, and we were also unaware that we actually were only sensitive to a tiny part of this spectrum. What a good theory of electromagnetism did for us is several things. First of all, it revealed that all of these different things are in fact manifestations of the same thing, and that it is a spectrum, and that the labels we put on this spectrum are convenient, but they're for our purposes. The underlying thing is a continuum, and it allowed us to develop technology driven by the theory that now lets us interact with this enormous range of things in the universe around us, to which we were previously basically completely blind. And that allows us to make applications that improve quality of life. So I want to argue that this idea, the idea of a unification that reveals a spectrum and an underlying symmetry to seemingly disparate phenomena, is in fact the exact way we should start thinking about diverse kinds of minds. So in my group, what I would like to do is to develop a framework that helps us to recognize and ethically relate to a very wide range of beings. And so not just the primates and birds and maybe an octopus or a whale that conventionally we think about, but also some really weird biologicals, such as colonial organisms and swarms, synthetic new life forms, AIs, whether robotic or purely software, and someday maybe exobiological alien entities, and some even very weird things that I probably won't have time to really talk about today, which aren't even conventional physical objects. And I think what we have here is exactly this kind of spectrum where we have names for different types of agents along the spectrum, all the way from passive matter, and I'm not sure there is any such thing, but we tend to think of the kinds of things that physics studies as sort of passive dumb materials, all the way up to whatever humans are with their metacognitive abilities and everything in between. And so what I'm interested in are theories of transformation and change, not sort of sharp categories, but actually how things scale along this continuum, and all the details are here. One thing to remember is that as we study these kinds of things, what I think we are working up along is this kind of spectrum where things get progressively weirder. As you start to leave this conventional area, the kinds of agents that we think about get stranger and stranger. And the one other precedent that we have is in the discovery of numbers, right? So originally we had the counting numbers, and then somebody invented zero, and then negative numbers, and then eventually people figured out that even the rationals weren't the limit of things, and so on. And what's important here is that each one of these expansions required a conceptual leap. It required us to break prior categories that we thought define what is essential about numbers. It actually was quite disturbing. So lots of people died, for example, when irrationals were discovered, like this poor guy Hippasus, was either killed or drowned on his own from the horror of this kind of thing. And we just need to remember that expanding these categories is not trivial. It's often painful, and the ability to recognize other kinds of things that didn't fit your previous category is in order so that you can do something useful with them, and in the context of what we're talking about now, which is other types of beings actually have some sort of active, compassionate relationship with them, is not easy. We as humans are really primed to recognize this kind of thing. So here's this Oscar-winning performance where this little squirrel-like creature sets up a little accident scene here, right? So he puts it right on the neck. He knows what his owners. He's got a very good theory of mind. He knows what the owners are looking for. In terms of paying attention to him, he's going to check in a minute to see whether anybody's watching, right? So these kinds of things, it's very easy for us to understand that there's a mind here, and so on. And that's because they operate at the same spatio-temporal scale. They operate within the same space as we do. They have roughly similar biological goals. And so things that are driven by brains, especially mammals, not really problematic usually. Well, there are some weird situations. For example, we have theories of mapping of functions onto brain structure and so on, and yet there are clinical cases, and Karina Kaufman, I reviewed it in this paper. There are cases where individuals have radically reduced amounts of brain tissue despite normal or even above normal performance. So even that's not simple. The mapping between brain and performance, even that's not easy. But in order to really understand what we are and how we come to be as embodied agents, we need to look at our origins, both evolutionarily and developmentally. So all of us start life as a little blob of chemistry and physics. So here's an unfertilized oocyte. Through the incredible process of embryogenesis, we become a fodder for either behavioral science or maybe psychoanalysis and other deeper kinds of things. One thing developmental biology shows us is that there is no magic kind of bright line at which physics ticks over to psychology. There is no special place where that happens. It's a continuous, gradual process, and it's really important to be able to understand that process. And by the way, this is not the end of the road, because there are other processes that can happen afterwards, including dissociative disorder known as cancer. I'll talk about that in a minute, and really other very strange things, such as your cells, for example, after the death of the body, your cells continuing their life in a totally novel embodiment, such as these Anthrobots that I'm going to show you in a minute. And it's also important to note that even the notion of an embryo isn't simple, because if you look at an early blastoderm, so let's say there's a couple of 100,000 cells here, and you say, well, there's an embryo. What are you actually counting when you say there's one embryo? What is there one of? Well, what there's one of is alignment. What there's one of is a story that all of the cells have bought into, a self model that guides their movement in anatomical space, in the space of possible anatomical configurations. And the reason there's one embryo is because all the cells agree that is where they're going. If you were to and I used to do this in duck embryos as a graduate student. If you take a little needle and you put some scratches in this blastoderm, each one of these islands doesn't feel the presence of the others, and so they align among themselves. They decide they're the embryo, but they all do it, and this is how you get twins and triplets and things like this. That means that the number of individuals inside an embryonic medium is not determined. It's not, certainly not set by genetics. It could be anywhere from 0 to probably half a dozen or more in a standard blastoderm. And so how many actual individuals or cells can emerge from that medium is not obvious, and it's a physiological outcome that shares actually a lot of both mechanistic and functional similarities with issues of individuation in the cognitive sense. So things like split brain patients, dissociative identity disorders, how many individuals are within a given set of real estate in the brain is and how many can actually fit. What's the maximum carrying capacity? We know this for standard computation. We do not know how to calculate this for neural substrates. And so it's incredibly dynamic process. Self-making, literally self-making, is a very dynamic process, and it's driven by this sort of thing. This is what we're all made of. This is a single cell. Now, this is a free living organism, but you get the idea. It's a single cell. There's no brain. There's no nervous system. There is, however, great competency in managing its own tiny little cognitive light cone. The spatiotemporal region of goals that it can pursue is small, but it's very good at doing what it needs to do. And even this, I mean, a lot of people are now catching on that cells have a kind of intelligence and competency and whatever. But it's not just that this goes down to the cell level. No, it goes far beyond that, because even the chemical material inside of that cell, not the cell itself, not the nucleus, not any of that, but just the chemical pathways, for example, gene regulatory networks or other chemical pathways. Just from the way the math works, they are themselves capable of at least 6 different kinds of learning, including Pavlovian conditioning. You don't need anything else. Just a set of interacting chemicals is already potentially capable of several different kinds of learning. And so already not only are we collective intelligences made of cells, but actually the cells themselves are a collective intelligence made up of components that do all kinds of interesting things that I don't have time to talk about today. But we are, for example, in our lab, taking advantage of the ability of these molecular networks to learn, to make applications such as drug conditioning and things like that. So our body is a multi-scale competency architecture. Every level from the molecular networks on up is a kind of agent that solves problems in various weird spaces. Okay, and because of our evolutionary firmware, we are pretty good at recognizing intelligence in 3-dimensional space. We're obsessed with the 3D world because of our vision, and medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds like birds and things like this. We can sort of pick that up. But biology exploits intelligence and goal-directed navigation in lots of different spaces. So the space of possible gene expressions, the space of possible physiological states, and the one we're going to talk about most is the anatomical morphospace. This thing that's essential for intelligence, this perception action loop, happens in all kinds of other spaces that are very difficult for us to recognize. This has lots of implications for things like AIs and various hybrids and organoids and things, where people look at them and say, well, this is not embodied. It just sits there. It doesn't move in the physical world, right? But the physical world is not the only world where you can do this critical perception action loop. And so what I mean by anatomical intelligence, I don't just mean complexity, and I don't even just mean reliability. I mean problem solving. And so here's a very simple example of a goal-directed system. So you have this axolotl. They are incredibly regenerative. They can restore most of their body parts. If it loses a limb anywhere along this axis, the cells immediately detect that they've been deviated from their target state. They will work really hard to get back there. And then the most amazing thing of all, they stop when they're done. When do they stop? They stop when a correct axolotl limb has formed. So this is an example of a very simple homeostatic process. The system has a goal, you deviate it from that goal, it expends lots of energy to get there, and then it stops. But this ability to, and in fact, it will work no matter where you cut. It makes exactly the right steps from here to there. So we can regain its position in that anatomical space it navigates. But this is not just about damage. It leads to that incredible plasticity leads to phenomena like this. If we make this tadpole with no primary eyes, this is a tadpole of the frog, here's the mouth, here are the nostrils, the brain, the tail. So if we make a tadpole with no primary eyes, but we put an eye on its tail, and I'll show you in a minute how we can do that. What happens is that eye makes a single optic nerve. The optic nerve does not go to the brain. Sometimes it synapses on the spinal cord here, sometimes to the gut, sometimes nowhere at all. And these animals can see perfectly well. How do we know? Because we built a device that automatically trains them on visual cues, and we can show that they learn for visual assays. And this is amazing. Why do you not need additional rounds of evolutionary adaptation here? You've got an animal with a radically different sensory motor architecture. The eye is connected to the spinal cord or some other organism, some other organ. Why does this just work? Out of the box? And that's because every instance of embryogenesis or regeneration or remodeling or metamorphosis is not a hardwired process driven by the chemistry of genetics. What it is a problem-solving process that takes place when an active agent interprets the information that it has, including its genetic affordances and everything else. So it gives rise to this incredible plasticity that we're going to look at the implications of this momentarily. So what we'd like to know is, how does all this work, right? So what's the cognitive glue that binds individual competent subunits like cells, and in fact molecular networks, into cells, into tissues, organs, and so on? What are the mechanisms and policies that allow these things to work together and embody a higher order individual that knows things that its parts don't know? Well, we know how this works in our bodies, as far as cognition is concerned. The cognitive glue that binds individual neurons together into us is electrophysiology or bioelectricity. It's the electrical networking of the cells in your brain that allow us to know things that our neurons don't know, and so on. Well, it turns out that that in particular is a scheme that evolution had discovered long before there were brains and muscles and things like that. Using electricity to bind things together into a larger scale collective intelligence goes back to at least bacterial biofilms. It's very ancient, and more generally, I don't have time to talk about this, but more generally, what evolution, I think, has done is to pivot some of the same navigational tricks across all kinds of spaces as life got more complex. So from metabolic spaces, physiological spaces, gene expression spaces, eventually multicellularity, and you get anatomical morphospace. Then muscles and brains appear, and you've got 3D behavioral space, and then eventually linguistic spaces, and who knows what else. But the interesting thing here is that what our brains are using to embody conventional cognition is exactly the same molecular mechanisms, meaning ion channels, electrical synapses, and neurotransmitters, exactly the same machinery as the collective intelligence of the body uses to make anatomical decisions. And so this is interesting. I don't plan to talk about consciousness too much in this talk, but just when I give these kinds of talks, I remind people that when you attribute consciousness to other humans that you're talking to, or other beings, you typically use one of three criteria. Either you're looking at mechanisms, you say, hey, they use the same mechanisms that I use and I'm conscious, so therefore they must be too. Or you're looking at behavior, so some sort of creative problem solving or something, and you say, okay, this is a sign of cognition and consciousness. Or you're looking at evolutionary continuity. You say, well, they're on the same evolutionary stream, and therefore they must have had it too. If you like any of these criteria, then you have to take very seriously the idea that every structure in your body potentially has some sort of likely nonverbal, and so you don't hear from it, but some level of conscious experience, because it fulfills all of the criteria that we normally use to attribute consciousness to each other. So what we're interested in is understanding, okay, if we're going to use the collective intelligence of morphogenesis as a model system, one of the things we'd like to do is to communicate with it. And in order to do that, the first thing we developed were some tools to basically read the information content of its mind. And so basically to read out the electrical activities, the way that neuroscientists read out the states of the brain. And we developed a fluorescent dye technology that allows us, so here are a bunch of cells in a dish deciding whether they should be a collective or not. Here are some cells in an early frog embryo. So these are not models. This is real data in time lapse, and you can see all the electrophysiology that goes on as these cells figure out who's going to be left, who's going to be right, anterior, posterior, and so on. So we have all kinds of computational methods that we've developed to model this phenomenon and to understand how it can underlie memories and large scale circuits that do pattern completion, which is basically regeneration, right? You lose a part of the body, and then you can sort of complete that pattern later. So we have all kinds of simulations. I want to show you some of these patterns. Not only do these electrical patterns serve as a kind of cognitive glue to bind cells together into a single body. And so here we have, this is a frog embryo putting its face together. And so this is one frame from that video. We call this the electric face, because what you see here is that before the gene expression and the cell behaviors that lead to forming a face, this is the memory that you can read out of what it's planning to build. So here's where the eye is going to go, here's where the mouth is going to go, here are some placoid structures. So the bioelectric stores a memory of what the thing is going to build, but it's also a cognitive glue across individuals. So here you can see when we poke this one, these two find out about this in short order. And the same thing here, you poke this embryo, there's a wave that goes, these are, each one of these is a whole embryo. These are not cells, these are whole embryos. So you can see that there's communication within and communication between individuals. They're sitting in an aqueous medium, which is how the wave can propagate. And then here are just a bunch of cells where you can see the incredibly complex electrical activity that they're able to drive. Okay, so we're able to read these things. Now, if you're going to communicate, you can't just listen, you have to be able to convey messages too. And so this is just one example. I could show you hours of this kind of stuff, where what we can do is say to some cells that are going to normally make a gut, we can give them the message that says make an eye. And that message is encoded electrically. We introduce it using potassium channels encoded by RNA that make a little voltage gradient that looks just like that eye spot that I showed you a minute ago. And sure enough, the cells get the message and they make an eye. Now, there's something very important here, which is that when I'm talking to you all, I don't need to worry about reaching in and making sure that all your synaptic connections are doing the right biochemical things so that you remember what I'm saying. You are going to take care of all of that because you're a multi-scale cognitive system. All I need to do is give you prompts with a very thin linguistic interface, and then you will do all the hard work of arranging the internals of your brain to act accordingly. The same thing is true here. We provide a very simple signal. It's a prompt. It says make an eye. We don't tell the cells what to do. We don't tell which genes to turn on and off. We don't talk to the stem cells. In fact, we have no idea how to actually make an eye any more than I have any idea of how to manipulate your synapses so that you remember what I'm saying. The system takes care of all of that because it is a multi-scale cognitive agent that takes high-level information, and it handles all the stuff downstream, including, if we only get a few cells here, they will do the job of telling their neighbors. So the blue ones are the ones that we injected. All of this other stuff, this lens that's sitting out in the flank of a tadpole, we didn't touch any of those cells. These cells told those cells what to do. They said, you need to participate with us to make this thing because there's not enough of us and by the way, these other cells resist. They have a different vision of the future that they were following before. And we can actually track the communication that goes back and forth and to see who wins, because it's a cancer suppression mechanism. Cells don't just pick up whatever message you happen to give them. They resist. They have their own idea of what they should be doing. So it's really all this morphogenesis is a constant battle of worldviews. It's a battle of models, and the cell collectives have to decide which model of the future they're gonna go with. Another thing you can do with this interface is to actually change the scale, the size of the self. In other words, the scale of the cognitive light cone, or the size of the goals that it can pursue. So again, the individual cells have little tiny cognitive light cones, and they remember very simple goals like hunger level or pH or things like that. And then that's what they pursue. Their homeostatic set points are very simple things like that. But these kinds of, for example, morphogenetic systems have huge grandiose goals like building a limb. And no individual cell knows what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have, but the collective absolutely does. And you know that because if you try to deviate it from it, you'll see that it knows what the set point is. So there's this question: can we show how connecting cells into a larger network allows them to have larger goals? How do you expand the size of the cognitive light cone? And this kind of weird way of thinking about it has therapeutic benefits. So we try to show some kind of practical implications for all this strange stuff that we say, so that other people can see why it's useful to think about it this way. Here's a human oncogene injected into a tadpole. It normally makes a tumor. You can track why. It's because oncogenes make the cells disconnect electrically from the rest of the network. When they do that, as far as they're concerned, the rest of the body is just external environment. So it's not that they're more selfish, it's that they have smaller selves. The border between self and world shrinks, and whereas before it was part of this big collective that could entertain thoughts about building a proper skin and muscle and whatever, now it's just an amoeba doing its thing, so metastasis. But what you can do is forcibly reconnect these cells to the collective, and we've done that here. And if you do that, the oncoprotein is still there. It's labeled in red, so you can see it's blazingly expressed. This is the same animal, but there's no tumor. We didn't kill the cells. We didn't fix the genetic lesion. We didn't do any of that. What we did do is force the cells to be part of this electrical network, where it is now part of a larger self with larger goals, with that working on anatomical things instead of being an amoeba in an environment. So just to kind of recap, what I've showed you is that this bioelectrical interface allows you to detect, reset, and communicate with a very unconventional collective intelligence. And what it does is think about how to move an anatomical configuration through the space of anatomical possibilities. And if we had more time, I could show you a whole bunch of different problem solving kind of competencies that it has along those lines. So all of this kind of way of thinking about it suggests to me a different kind of biomedicine. So everything that we do today is mostly bottom up. It's focused on the hardware here. If we actually focus not only on the software, but actually on the intelligence inside the agential material of life, you end up with all kinds of applications. Most of this I didn't get to show you. As far as training cells and tissues and top-down communication via electroceuticals and things like that. And so I think the future medicine is not going to look like chemistry. It's going to look a lot more like a kind of somatic psychiatry. Bioelectrics is one interface layer. No doubt there are others. There are biophotons and other things that probably will be developed. But I think the most well developed at this point is bioelectricity. So now we can ask, okay, so if the future of all of this is really the study of patterns, it's the study of patterns of thought and behavior that occur in these weird media, such as the electrical networks of your body. Where do these patterns come from? And the standard answer in biology is, well, they come from two places. Biologists love two kinds of explanations for things. One is history, in other words, a history of selection. The pattern is what it is because everything else died out, and this is what we have now. So in other words, there's a historical explanation for why this pattern, not some other pattern. And the other thing the biologists like is physics. In other words, patterns are constrained by physical effects. And the properties of the physical world, and so some of those patterns just come from the physics. So what's interesting though is that there are some patterns, and we can start with the ones studied by mathematicians that have neither a genetic nor an environmental explanation. In other words, this thing that you're looking at here, and then here are some videos of what the pattern actually looks like when you start tweaking the formula. This is a very simple function in complex number z. So z cubed plus 7, for example. If you do something called a Halley plot, where it's a very simple algorithm for plotting the roots of this and how the roots behave of this function, you get this amazing complex pattern. Doesn't hurt that it's kind of very organic looking, which is why I use this example. But what's salient here is that there's a tiny seed. It encodes a very complex, a very rich kind of structure. And if you wanted to explain why it looks like this, there are no facts of the physical world that explain it. There is nothing in the history of the physics of the universe that explains why this is the way it is. The explanation does not come from the physical world. You cannot tweak any of the the constants of the universe at the beginning of the Big Bang and get a different pattern out of this. It is an extra thing that is distinct from information you get from your genetic lineage and information you get from your physical environment. And there are plenty of patterns like this and like this and like this in that space as you play with these kinds of things. So so now we can start to ask, okay, so what does this have to do with biology? Could we find any living forms without a large scale history? In other words, if biologists will say that whatever form you have is driven by your evolutionary history, are there any beings that are picking up forms that cannot be explained in this way? So I'm going to show you just one. This is something called an Anthrobot. If I showed it to you for the first time, you may have already seen this. If you saw this for the first time, you might be tempted to guess that this is some sort of primitive organism that we picked up at the bottom of a pond somewhere. You might take a guess about its genome. You might think that, well, this will have an early genome of an early metazoan, for example. If you were actually sequence this genome, you would find out that it's 100% Homo sapiens. These Anthrobots are self-assembled from adult human cells. They come from tracheal epithelia that human patients donate. Some of these patients are alive and well when they donate this, some are not. So for those that are not, this is a weird kind of life after death where these cells self-assemble into a motile little organism. It matches no stage of normal human development. You would not be able to guess from the human genome that this is what you would get. Actually, you wouldn't even guess from the genome that the human body is what you would get, but you certainly wouldn't know this. So it's interesting. What capacities does this creature have? It's never existed on Earth before. There have never been any Anthrobots. There's never been any selection to be a good Anthrobot. What can it do, and where do those patterns come from? Well, one thing it can do, if you plate a bunch of human neurons on a dish and make a big scratch through them like this, one thing you'll find is that these Anthrobots cluster in what we call a superbot. So they make this like pile up, and then what they do is over the next 4 days they start healing the wound. And so if you lift it up, this is what you see. They're sitting there knitting across the gap. Okay. Now, who would have thought that your tracheal cells, which sit there in your airway for long periods of time dealing with dust particles and whatnot, that given the opportunity to reboot their selfhood, to reboot their multicellularity, would go on and make this kind of self-motile thing that, by the way, has the ability to heal your body. So obviously, this is a technology that we're developing for in-the-body repair. It's made of your own cells. You won't need immunosuppression once we figure out how to ask these cells to do the things we want them to do. This is all kinds of useful technology. But the other important thing about this is that first of all, they have 4 different discrete behaviors, and you can draw an ethogram of those transition states between those behaviors like you would in any animal. They have a drastically remodeled transcriptome. What I mean by that is this volcano plot shows different genes that they express differently than the tissue they came from. Each one of these red genes, there are about 9,000 of them, so almost half the genome is differently expressed than it is in that tissue. So when we say, why do humans look the way they look and have certain properties, you say, well, it's the human genome. Yeah, the same genome can also make this. And if you do enable them to make this, and we don't edit the genome, there's no weird nanomaterials, there are no scaffolds, no synthetic biology circuits. The cells do all the work. When they do this, they will pick and choose what they express from their genome, about half of them, to be in a completely different kind of form and function. So, okay, so just to kind of end here, I want to say a couple of quick things. The first thing, and so this is kind of the most the latest and the most kind of exploratory aspect of all this work, is that I see all of this stuff, the Xenobots that we build, the Anthrobots, the Chimeras, all the things that we make, I see them as exploration vehicles. I see them as enabling a systematic mapping of the relationship between the interfaces that we make, which are the physical objects. So I think all physical objects, including cells and embryos and bodies and robots and everything, all of these things are physical, are interfaces or pointers into a space of pattern. Mathematicians have known this for a long time. They study kind of one region of that space, and there's all kinds of truths and patterns of mathematical objects that don't come from the physical world. But I actually think it's a much richer space, and it contains other very high agency patterns that we recognize as kinds of minds. And everything that we do is basically poking holes in this kind of separation between the interfaces and the patterns that they ingress through these interfaces. And so it's just the very last thing I'll say is, lest we get too smug about our ability to access this space, because among us are certain geniuses that can perceive incredible incredible truths and works of art and literature and so on. And so they're picking out, right? They're picking out things out of that space and letting them come into the world. Lest we think that this is some kind of a human capability, I will just point out that first of all, there are no humans as a sharp category. So we are at the center of all kinds of continua, both developmentally, evolutionarily, whatever you think that humans are or can do. You have to have a story for where did it sort of evolve, where does it come from, and how does it scale? In fact, both with biological changes and technological changes, this again, the standard human category becomes extremely diffuse because of the plasticity of life that allows us to that allows it to be interoperable with all kinds of modifications. And this sort of thing, if you in the audience, if you're a therapist, or you're interested in the crisis of meaning and helping people through this and so on, you've got a set of some constituents that count on you for help. You really have to start thinking about here are your patients of the future. Okay, this is, the standard human patient is not enough. There are going to be all kinds of interesting new beings with all kinds of needs that we are going to have to address in some way. Some of these will have the same existential concerns as us. Some will have very different concerns. I think that because of this interoperability, all natural life is a tiny corner of this option space, and that pretty much every combination of evolved material, design material, software, and these patterns that you can't forget about as an ingredient is some kind of, there will be hybrids and cyborgs and just every possible kind of being that we are going to have to enter some sort of ethical synthbiosis with. And then the last thing the last thing I'll say is just this, that even that there's some serious humility warranted in all of this, because a lot of people think that A, it's complexity that makes all this work, or that B, there's something special about the biological material and this kind of trial and error process of evolution. And our work, and again, I don't have time to get into the details, but even looking at deterministic, extremely simple things that computer scientists study, like sorting algorithms, already you see that, yeah, it does the thing the algorithm tells it to do. But if you know how to look, you also find it doing all kinds of interesting side quests that the algorithm does not ask them to do, that are in fact kinds of that are things that you would recognize as aspects of cognition. Very minimal, but yet there they are. And so I really think this goes all the way down. This ability to have the freedom to express patterns from that space that are not fully determined by the physics of your world or the algorithms that we think you are following. It is always richer than that, even in extremely simple systems. And so just to remind us again, Magritte was telling us that our formal models are not the thing itself. And I would say the same thing. There's a lot of organicist thinkers who are down on computationalism, and they say living things aren't machines. They say, right, nothing is a machine, because a machine is a formal model that humans have defined to handle certain aspects of what physical objects do in the world. And it doesn't fully describe even the simplest kinds of systems, never mind, of course, the biological system. So nothing is a machine, but some things look like the machines, like a machine to lazy observers. And I think for exactly the same reason that the rules of biochemistry don't encompass the story of the human mind, formal models of algorithms and materials do not encompass the story of minimal beings. So really, I think we have to get much wider in our perception of what we can relate with. So I'll just, I'm going to end here and just thank the people who did the work that I showed you. Here some postdocs and students and collaborators in our lab, and disclosures. There are 3 companies that have spun off from the work that we do. And of course, thank our funders and the model systems, because they've done the most hard work in teaching us about this stuff. So thank you so much, and I'll stop here.
Great. Lovely. Thank you so much. So much to say in relation, but we're going to hand it off. I think, Matt, you're up first to offer some follow-up thoughts and your own thoughts in relation.
Great. And Gregg, what would be the ideal amount of time? I guess we have 2 hours for this whole.
I mean, we have till noon. So, I think what did you have planned? Whatever. That's what we kind of dialogued about.
Okay. All right. Well, if I go on too long, just
I'll keep an eye out for that. Okay.
I don't plan to. I'm here for the dialogue, and it's wonderful to be here. Really hard to follow your presentation, Mike. You continue to blow my mind with the research that you're doing and the theoretical connections that you're making. What I want to try to offer today is both a deep appreciation for the work that Gregg with John have done. I find the UTOK framework to be really helpful for making these fine-grained distinctions as we move up the evolutionary process. But I also agree with Mike Levin that there's a continuum here, and that we need to be very careful about the categories that we impose and the joint points that we think we see. While it's important to come up with definitions that can help us avoid false problems and dissolve things like the hard problem of consciousness, which I agree is a faulty framework, and I'll come back to that. I think we also have to be careful to avoid what Whitehead calls the fallacy of the perfect dictionary. There is no perfect language for this, and I think when I engage in dialogue about consciousness, it can be exhausting to, try to find points of contact where we come to an agreement about what we mean by consciousness, what we mean by mind, what's the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness, or sentience, awareness, perception, sensation, etc. But I don't really see any way around that that struggle in dialogue to arrive at and triangulate meanings for words that have such subtle connotations. So I'm a process philosopher. I draw a lot on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, and I'm going to lay out a perspective that grows from my study of his work. But I also consider myself a transdisciplinary researcher, and that may just be a fancy, more academically legitimate way of self-diagnosing as having ADHD. But on the other hand, I think I really feel that the importance of philosophy at this stage in our development as a species, as we try to understand the nature of nature, as well as the nature of our own humanity, philosophy's role is to help stitch back together the scientific disciplines, which over the last few hundred years have become increasingly specialized, such that even within biology, say, you have all these subdisciplines that speak different languages, and they can't even communicate with each other, much less with the physicists and the psychologists and the sociologists. And so as a philosopher, I really enjoy making friends with scientists and learning about their research. And I'm going to share a bit about some collaborations I've done with the astrobiologist Bruce Damer. He researches the origin of life, as well as the mycologist Merlin Sheldrake. But before I get there, let me just share my sense of what's involved in any attempt to develop a comprehensive understanding of the nature of reality. On the one hand, of course, we want to be scientific and pursue the truth. But I also think as human beings, if we're going to avoid this problem of consistency, and one of my favorite parts of this UTOK framework, as John and Gregg have framed it, is that science needs to consider its own presuppositions. Knowers are part of the universe they're attempting to know. And as Whitehead would say, epistemological problems are almost always disguised ontological problems. Before we can say how we know and what, before we can say how we know, we have to first know what there is to be known, because we ourselves as knowers are an example of what there is to be known. And so understanding the presuppositions of science is really important if we're going to understand the truth. But in addition to science and its pursuit of truth, I think as a human being, as a conscious agent who cares about my own existence, I also feel oriented towards this question of the ultimate nature of reality in an artistic way, in an aesthetic way, in a poetic way, as well as in a religious way. And so, of course, the three great Platonic transcendentals, the true, the beautiful, and the good, I think need to be integrated if we're going to pursue an understanding of reality, such that we can't simply seek a, while it's important to seek a precise well-defined set of scientific categories by which we can pursue truth. I also think that if we're going to avoid this kind of inconsistency that comes from performative self-contradiction, we also need to consider the other two transcendentals, beauty and goodness, often associated with art and religion, respectively. And the thing is, these aren't three separate compartments. As Whitehead says in the very beginning of his book, Process and Reality, the scientific pursuit of truth is itself a variant form of religious interest, right? Science is interested in the truth. Science values the truth. Truth is a value for science, right? And so in some sense, science is has this religious motivation, right, to understand the truth. And similarly, in physics, it's quite clear that beauty counts for something in arriving at the most coherent theoretical explanation for the empirical data that we're capable of collecting, right? So these aren't three separate domains. They overlap and mutually inform one another. But I think as a human being, I find it important to balance this quest for scientific truth, right, with a sense for aesthetic beauty and religious normativity or pursuit of the good. And I also, part of what I would want to offer here is an anthropocosmic orientation, which would imply that we have to begin with our human situation. Our human condition is such that we have these various ways of knowing, and we can understand these evolutionarily, drawing on someone like Merlin Donald, where he talks about this, these three stages moving from mimetic to mythic to theoretic understanding. We can understand this in terms of Jean Gebser, moving from magical to mythical to mental structures of consciousness. And so if we're going to understand the ultimate nature of reality, we have to be careful not to just begin with the theoretic in Merlin Donald's sense, or with the mental and rational in Jean Gebser's sense, and then try to explain everything in those terms. We have to deepen into into these more embodied ways of knowing, into story, into myth, and recognize, as the late sociologist Robert Bellah put it, drawing on Eric Voegelin's term mythospeculation. Whenever we're doing theoretical and rational, when we're engaged in efforts at theoretical and rational understanding, we're always also going to be engaged in storytelling. We're going to be relying upon metaphors. And so one of the problems with this enlightenment gap, as UTOK frames it, is that we thought we could do theory without story, right? We thought we could do rational explanation without a mythic substructure upon which, we're drawing for our common sense understanding of certain terms, and even the very motivation of science itself has a kind of mythic background. So rationality then, I think, for me in this anthropocosmic context, is really about developing proportional analogies, right? Rationality is always going to be about building analogies between what we know well and what we know less well. And that means that there is a certain kind of anthropocentrism to rationality and to our attempts to explain the natural world. But an anthropocosmic perspective, I think, is an effort to understand not the entirety of the world in terms of the categories that we're used to as human beings, but rather to stretch us beyond our common sense human categories into the weirdness of how the rest of the natural world does its thing, and to see ourselves as human beings as an exemplification of cosmogenesis, as an exemplification of the evolutionary process, rather than some odd, highly improbable exception to that evolutionary process. So when we try to do science, when we're pursuing the truth, I find Whitehead's work in the early 20s, 1920, very important. He wrote a book called The Concept of Nature, where he deals with what he calls the bifurcation of nature. And I think this bifurcation of nature, as he frames it, is related to, but somewhat distinct from, Descartes' distinction, or really dissociation between mind the thinking substance and matter, or the extended substance. The bifurcation of nature for Whitehead has to do with this split between physics and its understanding of a conjectured model of reality that would be beyond our perception, right? So Whitehead calls this the conjecture. And typically for physicists, this comes in the form of mathematical equations, which predict the behavior of energy or particles or fields. And on the other hand, of the other side of this bifurcation is our own subjective experience of value and the qualitative characteristics that we assign as perceivers to the natural world. And Whitehead calls this the dream, and he associates it with the nature poets, and says that if this bifurcation is in fact true, we have this split between the dream and the conjecture, between what we perceive and what is conjectured to be the cause of that perception, then really the nature poets should congratulate themselves on the beauty of the sunset and the sweet scent of the rose and so on, because it's the mind that's concocting all of the qualitative value and richness of nature. Nature itself is apparently just a bunch of equations in this view. So what Whitehead does to heal this bifurcation is he redefines nature as simply what we are aware of in perception. And if nature is what we are aware of in perception, that means nature includes the red hue of the sunset just as much as the electromagnetic radiation by which the physicists would try to understand that color, right? And so an unbifurcated picture of nature allows us to put our sensory experience, our perception, back into the natural world, and to then study nature to search for patterns whereby qualities and quantities hang together in a systematic way. And he makes a distinction in this book, The Concept of Nature, between two modes of thought. One would be about nature, one would be heterogeneous thought about nature, and the other would be homogeneous thought about nature. And I'll quote Whitehead here. This is from page 5 of The Concept of Nature. He says, "We are thinking homogeneously about nature when we are thinking about it without thinking about thought or about sense awareness. And we are thinking heterogeneously about nature when we are thinking about it in conjunction with thinking either about thought or about sense awareness or about both. I take the homogeneity of thought about nature as excluding any reference to moral or aesthetic values whose apprehension is vivid in proportion to self-conscious activity. The values of nature are perhaps the key to the metaphysical synthesis of existence, but such a synthesis is exactly what I am not attempting in this book on the concept of nature." He says, "I am concerned exclusively with the generalizations of widest scope, which can be effected respecting that which is known to us as the direct deliverance of sense awareness." Right. So in this book, before he gets into his later metaphysics and cosmology, which really starts in the 1925 work Science in the Modern World, and then especially in Process and Reality, in this earlier book, he's simply trying to do philosophy of science and to redefine nature so as to avoid bifurcation. But he's leaving outside of his picture of nature the mind, the knower, which he says is a metaphysical problem that in the philosophy of science we don't need to deal with. He'll deal with that later. What is the relationship between mind and nature? He says that's a metaphysical problem. In science, we can just define nature as what we are aware of in perception and assume knowledge, assume the mind. There wouldn't be science unless there was a knowing mind. But when we're doing science, in other words, homogeneous thought about nature, we don't need to take that into consideration. However, if we want to do metaphysics, if we want to understand how to overcome this enlightenment gap, then we're going to need to talk about value, moral and aesthetic value. And from Whitehead's point of view, value doesn't begin with animal minds. Value is intrinsic to the very nature of existence. Human values are derived from cosmic values, Whitehead would say. And this may be, potentially, this may be a point of tension here. Maybe I'll take 5 more minutes just to give some examples here from I'll look at a paper that Merlin Sheldrake and colleagues recently had published in Nature. They got the cover of Nature. The title was "A Traveling Wave Strategy for Plant Fungal Trade." And they're using a lot of economic metaphors here, but cognitive metaphors here to understand mycorrhizal networks and how they navigate their soil environment, making decisions, seemingly goal-directed decisions, whereby the hyphae tips at the edge of these mycelial networks are traveling through the soil, regulating carbon supplies and other nutrients, and they're finding that really there's a form of cognition going on here, whereby decisions are being made about how to balance cheap long-range exploration behaviors with the need for a reliable nutrient return, and that loops are added to these networks only when they shorten the paths to potential future partners. And so, in other words, part of what they mean by cognition in the case of these mycorrhizal networks and their growth patterns is that they're able to consider possibilities in the future. They're exploring a possibility space and making decisions about what would be the most efficient pathway to supply nutrients across the network. And so there's a kind of network optimization going on, a kind of cost accounting. There's context-sensitive resource allocation. And, we could say, well, these are all just metaphors and analogies. In Merlin's book, Entangled Life, he goes even further using these sorts of analogies, talking about memory and thinking going on, problem solving going on at the level of these mycelial networks. But again, if rationality is itself essentially about developing proportional analogies, and if, as Mike's research is also showing, there's a continuum of agency and awareness all the way down the scale of nature, then I think we shouldn't just think of these as just metaphors, right? Similarly, with Bruce Damer's research, he and I have co-authored a long chapter where he begins with his empirical account of the origin of life in terms of wet-dry cycling. He's working with the biochemist Dave Deemer at UC Santa Cruz on this. And basically, without going into too much detail, what they're showing is that there is a continuum between non-living chemistry and living organisms, and there are no sharp lines here, and we can even get a kind of chemical selection going through this wet-dry cycling process and shallow volcanic ponds was their scenario. And what this is suggesting is that rather than looking for the single heroic cell that achieved the feat of self-production and reproduction, we should instead think more in terms of distributed networks. And as Bruce Damer likes to say, it could be that the progenitor of life was actually more complicated than the first properly living cell, self-producing and reproducing cell. And so that kind of scrambles our usual sense of, oh, evolution is about things getting more and more complex. Well, not necessarily. It could be that evolution is about finding ways to do more difficult tasks in a simpler and simpler way, right? So finally, let me say that, just to reiterate and to close up here, I think a point of real convergence between my own Whiteheadian and process approach and the UTOK approach is that whenever we're thinking about the nature of the universe, we have to start from the fact that we as conscious agents exist and that we can inquire into the nature of nature. And any theory that begins without presupposing conscious agency, I think, is going to fall into performative self-contradiction. And both John and Gregg have emphasized that their account of extended consistency requires looking at these same presuppositions, right? So science needs to account for the fact that there are scientists, that scientists have emerged in the process of the evolution of the universe. And from the anthropocosmic perspective I'm offering here, mind is not merely an add-on to nature. Nature is imbued with and pregnant with mind. Nature is always already seeded by it. And I'm using the term mind, which I know has a specific meaning in UTOK. But, in the effort to avoid the fallacy of the perfect dictionary, I hope you can grant me this broader use of it. So, also another point of convergence would be understanding causality in a non-linear and more contextual way. If nature is seeded with mind, it's not that the seed alone explains anything, but nor does the soil alone explain anything. Causation is always contextual. A little aside here, I collaborate also with some physicists like Ruth Kastner, who's developed the so-called possibilist interpretation, possibilist transactional interpretation of quantum physics, where she points out that rather than thinking just about the emission of a wave potential, we also have to remember that there is the other side of the coin, which is the absorption of the wave potential. And she thinks that physics has had, she uses the yin-yang metaphor. Physics has tended to have a more yang focus. It's looking at the emission and has backgrounded or forgotten the role of the absorbers. And so I encourage folks to look at the transactionalist interpretation for another example at the quantum level of light and quantum transactions of this nonlinear form of causality. Can't go into more detail on that right now. So this is a shift from linear to contextual causation. And to me, it's really the most attractive aspect of extended naturalism. We're seeking a relational multi-level understanding of causal unfolding. I think we can rehabilitate something like Aristotle's four causes in this context, but we need to throw Aristotle, into evolutionary motion for this to work. And so evolution on this view is the process whereby, and here we could say nature, or we could say spirit, because from my point of view, I don't know that I'm strictly a naturalist, although I, of course, want to make sure that my explanations are adequate to the empirical evidence, respond to the empirical evidence, but I also think that it makes sense to talk about spirit. And so evolution is a process whereby I would say spirit potentiates itself and becomes ever more complexly incarnate in living forms. And we can think of the levels through which it becomes incarnate in a variety of ways, right? We can't claim that we've definitively carved nature at the joint with some set of categories, but I just throw these out there. Light, life, looking, and language, right? Might be four general categories that mark the levels of emergent emanation, right? So light is about quantum transactions, which I briefly discussed. Life is about cellular autopoiesis. Looking is about perceptual agency. Language is about symbolic reflexivity. So at each level, new distinctions are becoming relevant as minded nature moves deeper into relationship with itself, differentiating into ever richer and more intense unities. But there's never any ontological breaks here. There's never a moment when mind might emerge from new arrangements of matter. Matter, and here I'm going to speak mythically, matter is fallen light, and light was, is, and will always be on its way to logos. Okay, I'll stop there.
All right.
Bonnie.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We're holding questions, so we're going to jump right into Bonnie. Thank you so much, Matt.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Gregg. Hi, Michael. Gregg, is it possible for me to do a PowerPoint to keep myself tidy and clear?
Absolutely. I think
Okay.
you're listed as a presenter, so you should have a share screen capacity.
Okay. Okay, so let me frame my contribution here. So I've been around for a long time. In the late 70s and early 80s, I was doing neurophysiology first at Woods Hole and then Princeton as an undergrad. Then I got a National Science Foundation grant to do neurophysiology. That's what we called it back then at UC Berkeley. But I'd already also had a BS in philosophy. And in the lab, I was very frustrated by these degenerate assumptions that persisted and overdetermined the science. And that made me not such a good postgraduate student. And I think what the work we're all doing is very important because the models in the science and the metaphysics creates popular metaphors that really flavor and shape who we think we are as people and how we relate to the natural world. I think this is huge cultural importance in the work we're doing. So I decided to pretend I was this postdoc who's interested in metaphysics in Dr. Levin's lab, and what kind of questions, that pesky little postdoc I was, what kind of approach might I have? So with your permission, to have that kind of trope running here. All right, let me. My work tends to, I try to highlight simple but powerful concepts. So hopefully this won't be such a cognitive load on the audience. All right. So first I want to frame this by talking about how I orient to science and metaphysics. These are simple, not comprehensive, but I think just as an orienting generalization. So science is involved in prediction. It identifies, quantifies, and specifies actions that lead to predictable outcomes. There's a precision in science that uses measurement to precisely describe observations. This is lovely work that Michael's team is doing that, I'm happy not to do. Causality, it assigns causal relations to observed phenomenon and events. We as normal people expect science to answer these causal loops for us. There's a need to offer explanatory and functional descriptions to processes. We call these mechanisms. Some people are allergic to that word. I share with Dr. Levin whenever I'm teaching, and I can show some fantastic mystical experience can be explained by certain cognitive mechanisms. People feel that's reduced that experience, and I just think it's just amazing that, because when we assign these mechanisms, we don't really know what's happening. Like the mystery just gets deeper and deeper. And then there's this thing about equivalences. We could go into these in detail, but it uses mathematical equations to show relational equivalences. And what I call perfect relations is like V equals IR. This is the holy grail of science, that you can have E equals MC squared. And in my teaching, I have a whole warning about this, because just because you have maths doesn't mean it's correct. And the physicists, theoretical physicists know this. There's many world interpretations of the same equations. Okay, but we're not going to get into that. All right. Now, metaphysics, this is the standard for a robust metaphysics, in my opinion. There's this need to have clarity, precision in language, clean definitions, and sharp reasoning. Now, Whitehead, in my opinion, fails here because he was writing at the cusp of new understanding. And when you're writing at the edge of your own understanding, you don't necessarily achieve this. And then you have Hartshorne, maybe did a little bit better. But a good metaphysics really needs to achieve this kind of clarity. And hopefully you can use some of these standards in what I'm going to show you. I hope that I meet them myself. This thing that I call simplexity. It captures the essence of something by releasing the complexity without reducing the complexity. So the shift from the Earth-centric concept of the solar system to the heliocentric concept released the complexity of the math that you needed to define the epicycles, but it didn't reduce the complexity. It wasn't a reduction of the situation. This is a very big point in metaphysics. Error correction, Gregg and John are really working hard at this, correcting error within or contradictions across disciplines. Unity, scope of the concepts, expanding the capacity to say more with less. So Whitehead's notion of prehension was used across many, many different kinds of concepts. And then I add this one, pragmatic, always coming back to experience. And what I mean by that is kind of James's delicate empiricism. So there's both an internal journey and an external journey, and hopefully those work in concert. Okay. So here's a basic So science, we can reduce this, we can boil this down to science is what is the correct level of reduction to advance the field. And Dr. Levin talks about this, you know, if you're going to go in looking for physics, you'll get physics, all right? So that's an interesting question, but I honor, you know, we want to honor that that's part of the scientific advance. And metaphysics is what's the right level of abstraction to advance the field, right? So I can get so abstract and say turtles all the way up, or as Gregg said this morning, elephants all the way up and all the way down. It's too abstract, right? But if I don't have the right level of abstraction, then I get lost in the details, and then you get this splitting silos of the scientists because there's not a common abstraction to work from. Okay. So here's a level of abstraction. I teach this all the time to people. So my basic model is this, that there's an arousal state. So this is the model. I'm going to go from mind to consciousness. There's an arousal state. So what can be an arousal state? An electron's in a high level orbit, and it has to push out a photon, and then it jumps to a lower orbit state. Or you put fish in front of a sleeping cat, and there's an arousal state. And the arousal state seeks actions that satisfy. Now, I use this word actions because I believe what's at this end are always actions. They're actions in the real world. Okay, so I believe, for example, that thoughts in your mind are actually are activities. You know, we call it pond life in your mind. Okay. Now, this is every single concept I'm introducing here, we'll see why they're very important. So arousal states are always a threshold event at the focal individual, right? So if my blood sugar level is going down, then there's arousal states, let's say, in the cells in the pancreas, but I'm not aroused yet. But then there might be a threshold event in the blood sugar level at the point that the focal individual, me, Bonnie, gets aroused. So we always have to understand what is the focal individual we're talking about, because there's many, many sub-threshold activities that are happening below the arousal state of the focal individual, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, my definition of mind is what happens between the arousal state and the actions that satisfy. This is a very important point for me, and that is you'll notice that the whole formula is already in a evaluative state. So I'm aroused, and there's a movement toward an action that satisfies. Something is evaluating the situation from the get-go. So there's a value aspect to this that is already in the equation. Okay. This is another thing that's very big. I'm not going to go into all of it. These are just these metaphysical concepts that I think are extremely important, and I see them all, you know, in Dr. Levin's work. Maybe that's naive of me, but all of that I just described doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a pre-established order, and there's the production of a new order when mind arises. And I think this is, I'll look at it a little later, extremely important. So for example, if I think of a single cell organism, the level of mind it's just kind of oscillating in a pond, and it touches something it doesn't like, it moves away, touches something that it does like, okay? It's not even sensing a sugar gradient. It's just oscillating between these evaluative kind of experiences. That organism could never have evolved if the environment was completely disordered. The environment already establishes, so when I'm saying here, and I can't do it all today, but the environment is part of the cognitive growth of the organism. And so you can always ask, for whatever kind of mind you have, what is the pre-established order? What is the new orders produced? And this gives us some insight into why you have these emergent new minds, because every mind is part of this what I call the global state model of these things. Okay, so these are very general concepts. That's what I think metaphysics does. Okay, global state model. All right, now part of the global state model, I would argue, is that as this wave of mind is coming through, there must be a background gradient. There must be a background gradient. So the gradient in many cases in science is an epistemological gradient. It's just, we're too coarse grained. We say matter or life. That's an epistemological gradient. But I believe there's this very Whiteheadian, there's a background topology across which you call a gradient array, topological relations, or protension, a subtle structure across which when the dynamics happen, at each gradient meets a threshold event is met, and you get the impression that there's discrete emergence. And this is my model of emergence, that there's continuity in the background, there's a subtle gradient or topology, and when those gradients get there's threshold events in the evolutionary dynamics or process, or for example, I would say some of your work is creating different pre-established orders, showing, and then some of these threshold events that are subsistent, that are actually in the background as a gradient. Maybe they're your Platonic patterns, I don't know. But this is why we get over time this impression that there's discrete events. Okay. Maybe I won't go into this one. All right. So one thing that's very, I wish people would spend more time in, because it's extremely well understood. You've got James Austin for one. I can't remember the others I was going to cite. But there's two global processing modes. There's an egocentric mode that references the organism. So when I said the nature mind is an evaluative field, what is it measuring, right? So the organism is measuring its own needs, but there's also an allocentric mode where the organism measures objects in relationship to other objects. So let me say what I mean. This used to fascinate me. I used to live in this big post and beam house with this three-story great window that overlooked this huge deck that overlooked the lawn. And we'd sit there and we'd hang out with the dogs. And when the dogs saw a squirrel in front of them, they did not try to run through the window. There was a dog door on the opposite side of the house. As soon as they saw the squirrel, they'd run through the door over there, because they were mapping the relations between here I'm here, the squirrel's there, in an allocentric mode, okay? This is very well researched. Rats do this with mazes, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these two important, so these are, I think, are key concepts in the work that are underlooked. And it's too bad, because there is a lot of previous work and how the different global rhythms in the brain do this, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now I'm going to tell a story and then I'll end. This very simple story, but this is my way of addressing the hard problem of consciousness. So here we have a, you notice my diagram's extremely complex. Okay, so first organisms, we only have egocentric modes and I would argue that an egocentric mode is the definition of subjectivity. Okay, you can place that word wherever you want, but I say that's what subjectivity is, that something matters to the organism, the evaluation is going toward the organism. Okay, so you have this little membrane. If it's a single-celled organism, but I didn't make it a circle, we're just looking at this membrane. Something happens at the membrane, right? So this little arousal state, and it's co-varies with something that happens in the interior, right? So there's an ion exchange, and then something changes here, and something changes here. So you have this internal monitoring of the membrane. And this word co-varying is extremely important, okay? So there may be a delay, there may be a series of sequences, but there's something that if X happens here, Y happens here. If A happens here, B happens there. This is the subtle beginning of mapping, because that's what mapping is. Something here is covariant with something here. That's what a map is. So we have an extremely primitive definition of internal representation. Okay, extremely simplistic. Okay, now this little organism evolves, and part of the membrane becomes a pseudopod. You see, it has a little pseudopod. And when the pseudopod touches something, that creates a cascade of events that changes something in the membrane, that then co-varies with the internal monitoring. And so basically you have the motor, this is a sensory motor cell, because the motor activity is being internally monitored, okay? I know this is very simplistic, but yeah. Okay, so now you have organism. These are all egocentric modes. And part of, all of a sudden, one of the pseudopods gets a ear-like or an eye-like thing. Let's say it's an eye-like thing, a simple eye. And something weird happens, because now something from the environment is co-varying with something that happens on the eye. And that co-varies with the memory, and that co-varies with the internal monitoring. And now what you have is you have a map from the internal monitoring to the external world. This is part of the external world, but it's in direct contact, okay? So this is very interesting to me, to ask questions of different people's models. All right, now we go to now all of a sudden we have an allocentric mode, but we have a reason. How do these maps that are all relative to internal modeling become maps that are allocentric modeling? And I love this when you said, Dr. Levin, it's like a triangle. You get the first two, you get the third one for free, because this is exactly what happens. If internal monitoring is covariant with actions and internal monitoring is covariant with perceptions, then actions and perceptions can easily be translated as covariant. And this is what I call the umwelt. Now, this is not an internal representation in the organism's mind yet, but what it is it's a lived experience of the relationship of the organism to the natural world. Now, here's what's very important, is that at this point, this is a big deal, because what happens is that the things like the co-construction of the animal's environment, the umwelt, becomes extremely important to the cognitive architecture of the organism here. And that's before you have internal representation. So the mapping that happens between the organism and the environment, this creates a pre-established order that is a difference that makes a huge difference, okay? And then the last one is, second to last one, is very hard to draw these when they get this complex. So we know rats can simulate the environment in their dreams, for example. We know insects, many organisms can simulate this relationship in their internal experience. So we have the kind of mind that starts to simulate the environment, their virtual perceptions. They run sub-threshold activities that mimic external. So what you're just doing is you're running this in sub-threshold levels of action in the organism and producing these virtual environments. This is what I call is extremely important order that emerges in the animal world, habitat and habitats. So the beaver has the habitat internally organized, and the order that established between basically we're expanding the participatory space of the cognitive architecture through the agent and the environment. It's not like agent and environment opponent processing. And this is one of these persistent malwares in science, is that we have so classified the environment as like adaptive pressure, adaptive stress, threatening survival, that we kind of miss this symphony, this larger symphony that is happening. Okay, and the last one is, no, second to last. So now we know rabbits can simulate novel environments in addition, so they can start to be created with this. So the virtual world is starting to become quite heavily populated. This is well researched. It accounts for latent learning. And then we finally have the human, where we start to simulate the self inside these novel environments. And the interesting thing is that this is also well documented, is that the virtual perceptions in the mind follow there's two modes. There's the allocentric mode, which is this mapping of allocentric representations. And then we get a new virtualized egocentric mode. What does it mean to me, my ego, me, mine, I? And what we have then in this small story of metaphysics is a recapitulation of the whole thing. Here's the organism with a simulated membrane, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is my what I call metaphysics.
Awesome. Okay. Wow. Thank you deeply to each of you for coming and sharing your wisdom and perspectives. I'm going to offer just a couple of quick thoughts. I'm sure John will want to offer, but it's crucial to make a couple of points so that we can see that there's actually, in my estimation, there's an enormous amount of convergence that's operative here. Although, if you pay attention just to languaging, it may be like there's some real divergence. And so I need to spend a little time on some languaging issues because extended naturalism is trying to do certain things with language. I appreciate Matt's point about, hey, there's no perfect language. But there's actually been some grammatical, big picture grammar problems on knower-known relations, on cognition, on epistemic, on mind, on consciousness. And it's really important for us to kind of like sort some of that out. So I'm just going to throw up a slide real fast. This won't take very long. And I want to drop this into the conversation that we're having because I'm not using mind like cognition at all. I'm not using mind as consciousness at all. I'm not using mind as an epistemic process. It has these elements in it. But I want to take mind for a particular reason, just mindedness, or just when I'm using mindedness. But let me just show you this diagram and then say, actually, Mike and I, surprisingly enough, are really talking about very, very similar things, even though it may sound like we're talking very different things. So let me just share this real briefly. And so here's Mike's cognitive light cones. And I am in love with cognitive light cones. I love cognitive light cones. And I realized that cognitive light cones actually were part of an insight I had in 1997 when the tree of knowledge popped out of my head, although I didn't call them cognitive light cones at the time. So what's that? Well, this is, of course, the tree of knowledge. Behind me is the little diagram that actually gave rise to it. Then I had to craft and figure out what the hell is this thing? What are these things that I'm representing? And I have my own ways of doing this, but there are a couple of things I really want to say about it. First off, yes, I call this mine, but it's really important to know that I'm a behavioral scientist by training. I learned as the concept of behavior, actually. Okay. And that's actually a real big mistake because it turns out the concept of behavior, as behaviorists learned it, is a concept that they're actually taking from the metaphysics of science, to use a Bonnie term, behavior. If you go, Mike, to your thing, you go behavior all the way down, and it's actually entities and fields and patterns. That's actually what is the metaphysical concepts. And then we create a epistemological lens on behavior through science that says we can observe it and measure it. And then we can gain experimentations and mathematics to extract out of it, which, by the way, are the primary qualities in the world of natural physical science, that they then miss the subjective qualities of the epistemic interior. That's actually the whole design of it. Ask Phil Goff in relation. So why does it become mind blind? Well, it becomes epistemically knower blind on the one hand, and it doesn't know how to then maintain continuity. And then this is now where you and I can dialogue a little bit and understand discontinuity at some level. Clearly, there's both continuity and discontinuity. What may be salient to the tree of knowledge, if you look at it, is discontinuity. But of course, if we look carefully, it's continuity everywhere. But there are emergent processes, actually emergent emanating processes that John and I talk about. And we can talk some about this, but I'll make this point really quick. So when you hear me say mind, let's just translate that into, 3D behavioral space. Okay. So the red dimension emerges in the Cambrian explosion precisely because there's an emerging sensory motor loop whereby you're getting a higher order structure that's tracking. That's collective intelligence the nervous system is basically, in my estimation, a model of the living system. And so it's just a higher order model of the living system, exactly because it has exactly the same basic structure to it. And indeed, I'll argue that mind 2 consciousness, at least, is just a model of mind 1, which is then modeling life space. It's building off of the morphological, physiological, transcriptive space, and then extending a cognitive light cone. In fact, I can see these things as essentially cognitive light cones all the way down. And so what you're highlighting here actually is you're using mind and I'm using as the way I would use cognitive, and I want to bind mindedness to 3D behavioral space for interesting reasons that we could dialogue about. But if I say mindedness and you say, oh, what emerged from living biocognitive consciousness intelligence into the higher order 3D behavioral space that allows that squirrel to do its thing. And when you go into the forest, you do see birds and bees occupying a problem space that's quite different than the trees that occupies a morphological space. Then it's just a different space that you've been pointing to. And my definition of mindedness is, well, how does the thing collectively organize in that space-time cognitive light cone? So that's what we can come back and talk about. And the other thing, to Matt's point, that I want to make about it, this is not a perfect language system. This is not a complete language system. And if you're a mycologist, okay, you're like, dude, where the hell are the mushrooms? Okay, they're like a whole layer of like in between plants and animals that afford a particular kind of sort of bioecological intelligence across spectrums that I'm not really attending to. And it'd be very easy for me to believe that there's essentially a mycology information processing system that I'm not picking up on in this diagram. There are many possible information processing systems that are not picking up on the diagram. So I want to be clear, at least in this structure, about the languaging. There's reasons I want to attach mind to mindedness for good reasons. And the last thing I'll say is that actually consciousness has got to be referenced in relationship to the way we talk about it as human beings. There is a particular way in which the brain activity is associated with the first-person experience of being in the world that gives rise to that experience that we're referencing, that is unlikely to be anything like that in a single cell or anything that doesn't have a brain. So we can come back to that dialogue also. I will certainly say what we reference as everyday consciousness is reliably associated with higher order brain activity for very good reasons in terms of its nature of its structure. However, morphological intelligence, transcription intelligence, physiological intelligence, totally different ballgame. And there's an enormous amount, as your brilliant work shows, of intelligence at those various problem space levels. And we need to think seriously about those and be awakened to them. And you've done that. So that's one of the things that I just wanted to get clear about in terms of just some of the core possible terminology differences. I'll stop sharing there. I know John will undoubtedly want to say some things, and then we can jump in and have a cool conversation till noon and wrap it up.
Yeah,
John?
Amazing talks. It's great to see all three of you again. Hi, Mike. Hi, Matt. Hi, Bonnie. It's good to see you all. I think I'll start with some maybe some very abstract observations. I think we're wrestling with a deep conceptual issue here, which is what the hell we're trying to pick out with continuity. We don't mean identity, and we don't just mean a continuum. And this is a problem I brought up before, because then you fall into Sorites fallacies. Sorites is, if I remove one grain from the heap, it's still a heap. and therefore I can remove all the grains and still have a heap. That's a classic problem, which means differences of degree have to become differences of kind, or you fall into Sreidy's paradoxes. But then, right, you don't want absolute discontinuity, because you have all the evidence that Mike is pointing to. And the problem we're trying to get at is we're trying to get at something in which we're holding, and this is where the work of William Desmond is so good. We're trying to hold identity and difference as equally important ontologically. And what we've had is we've had reduction, which emphasized identity, and then we've had various kinds of relativisms or things like that that emphasize difference. And then we've had the dialectic, which tried to fold the difference back into the identity, and therefore ultimately reprioritized identity. And Desmond's work is saying, no, all of those are not good at sort of getting us access to being. And I think we're wrestling with how are we going to talk about, we use a word, continuity, and I think we have something like the color spectrum as the picture that has us in a script. But what we're actually doing with that picture, it strikes me, is we're wrestling with something that is very unclear to us, because the models we have of reduction and relativism and dialectic aren't working. They don't pick up on the way we're trying to equally hold identity and difference. And we're trying to do that with terms like emergence and emanation and so forth. And now I happen to think that problem is now also a mesh with another problem. Mike, I don't think you saw my talk yesterday, but there was a good question, and it drew something out about this vertical dimension. And you see, the Neoplatonists, they discovered or they proposed a fifth kind of causation. And they did this because they were trying to wrestle with some very important problems around abstract entities. The standard argument by most physicalists is abstract entities are by definition outside of time and space, and therefore they can't have any causal power. And they don't even seem to be bound to particular patterns. They seem to be generators of multiple patterns. That's what your work shows. And so what the Neoplatonists argued is, well, what you have is we have this relation of participation, which is in the same family as continuity, by the way, continuum. And we're using this language, we're using metaphors, we access that space, we download it. But of course, we don't mean either one of those. And it's very unclear, I think, what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about this paradigmatic causation. It doesn't fit in cleanly to efficient, final, or even formal causation or material causation. It's something else. And I think these two problems are interwoven, because as we try to get this paradigmatic vertical causation, as Wolfgang Smith used to call it, a very interesting but also a confusing way of talking. And you have Whitehead's language of ingression and other things like that. I think that problem of what do we mean by that is intersecting and intermeshed with this problem of what are we trying to do when we're trying to hold equally to identity and difference in our explanations. And I think those two problems so these are observations that I think we're running into some very deep problems here about we're poking on a new kind of causation, and we're poking on something like participation in a continuum, and then a continuum is somehow not capturable by reduction, relativism, or dialectic. And it's like, what the fuck do we use to talk about it? And I think that's a problem we're bumping up against. And then the third provocation is behind all of this is something really strange, which is I think we're talking about God a lot here, but we don't want to say it because we have this space of, the paradigms that somehow the lower levels participate. But what is being participated, like we used to think of it as just sort of a set, like a figure. But as Mike's work shows, how this thing can get participated is open-ended. Like it is so incredibly rich in what it can participate. And that space of those Platonic forms, right? It's obviously interconnected in some fashion. This is one of Whitehead's classic arguments, because things don't ingress in a chaotic fashion. They ingress in a weird fashion, but not chaotic. There's a sense to it. And then I point out to you, given the richness and the interconnectedness, this was the Neoplatonic problem, right? There has to be something that holds them and does something analogous to relevance realization. Why is that paradigm there chosen here and not that one there? And so you have something up there that's holding and organizing and selecting, and that's part of it. Somehow is interwoven with this participation, and it's interwoven with the problems of reality being a continuum. And I mean, I have a lot of problems with calling that God because of all of the associations, but we're talking about real abstract entities that have their own kind of causal realness, paradigmatic cause. They're organized. They're hyper-rich, hyper-dimensional, hyper-objects that are somehow hyper-dimensionally interconnected, and yet we get very, specific selections into, right, accesses into specific entities and realities. And so I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think we're bumping into some very ancient problems here. I think we're bumping into some very key problems that Neoplatonism really wrestled with very deeply. What is this vertical? And what's its kind of causation? How do we talk about continuum without falling into Theseus's ship or the Sorites paradox or simple reduction or simple relativism or just a dialectic, right? Which in the end reprioritizes, according to Desmond. I guess what I'm asking is, how open are we to exploring that? I mean, I think Matt should be very open to it, because that language, Neoplatonism, moved very smoothly between religion, art, and science. And that was one of its great gifts. But one of the things that holds modernity and post-modernity together, one of the few things they agree on, is the rejection of Plato and Neoplatonism. And so we're doing something very radical here. And I guess I want to put that, I want to really, really emphasize how radical this is getting. I'm not, this is not any kind of refutation. I hope you understand. I'm trying to radicalize it. We're talking about different kinds of causation. We're trying to come up with a logic beyond, reduction, relativism, and dialectic. And we're invoking something like what people used to talk about when they talked about God. And we're doing that all in a way that's going into the guts of like really nuts and bolts science. And I find that noteworthy. So that's the end of my commentary. I just want to throw that out about how noteworthy this is. This is becoming a really radical proposal that we're talking about. And it's really interesting that in order to really account for life, intelligence, and consciousness, how much we have to radicalize our metaphysics, which is very contrary to the utopian hopes of the European Enlightenment, that we could have a radically simplified metaphysics that would account for everything. So that's my commentary.
All right, lovely. Actually, there's been a lot said. I kind of want to at least give Mike a chance. Bonnie, I see you have your hand. And before I go to the audience, let's at least have the speakers, and then we'll take questions. Mike, if there's been a lot said, so feel free to jump in if you have a reply to anything in particular.
Well, happy to. There's lots of interesting ideas, but I think Bonnitta had her hand up a minute ago. Why don't we let her go first?
Sure, then.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, respond to John. Excellent. I would say God in my model that's why I call it pre-established order, because it's a knockoff of Leibniz's pre-established harmony. I'm sure you picked up on that. And so what is the necessary or pre-established order that affords the subsistent gradient thresholds across which everything else flows? And I know that a lot of what transpires between our language is a matter of emphasis. But I would say, yes, we need a radical new metaphysics, and these ancient problems that don't go away. I would like to suggest that they are the persistent degenerate assumptions that have overdetermined our research. But that's, more of my point of view. Okay, thank you, Gregg.
Okay, Mike, and then Matt, and then we'll take audience.
Sure. I guess, okay, the one thing that I want to talk about is what John just raised, which I think is not only super important, but actually now tractable as a research program, which is the specificity with which these patterns show up, right? So what I take us to be doing is exploring the mapping between the physical pointers that we build. And when I say pointers, I mean, engineered objects, cells, embryos, biobots, all of it. And the patterns that you get when you create those things, right? So we need to understand that mapping between the pointer and the thing that it points to. And I agree with you. I absolutely think it's an organized space with a metric. And so I think we traverse that space with simple systems. We traverse it when we solve problems or get insights or whatever. These are all different, to me, different ways of navigating that space. And one thing I think we have to be ready for, and again, I agree that it has to get much more radical than we've been thinking about, is that we used to think that, and I guess most people still do, that there's a pretty straightforward relationship between the structure of what you build and what you're going to pull down. So all of neuroscience is basically around the fact that, well, this is the kind of circuit, and look, you get this kind of behavior, that kind of behavior. So I just want to point out how wrong I think that is, or not wrong, but limited. And I want to go back to the example that Bonnitta brought up, which is the dogs and the squirrel. So when the dog sees the squirrel and goes the smart way, which is actually physically further from the obvious as the crow flies distance to the squirrel, is one way to look at that is a phenomenon called delayed gratification, which we study in behavior science. So two magnets, if you put a piece of wood between them, will never sort of come around and meet, because what they can't do is go against the gradient. They are not going to go backwards against the gradient they're trying to maximize. They just don't have the mental chops for it. And we get that, and we say, okay, and so now there are animals and other things that can do that. They can move against the gradient of their goal to actually recoup gains later, and this is delayed gratification. So I just want to point out that. And so you might think, okay, so in order to do that, you need some sort of cognitive architecture that embodied in neurons or in something else that allows you to forecast the future and plan different paths and all this stuff. If you take, and again, I realize you can look up the paper and you'll see all the details. I'm just going to say it in 30 seconds. If you take what's known as a sorting algorithm, any of you that write code, we're talking bubble sort, okay? This is 6 lines of code. It is completely deterministic. The code tells you exactly what it's designed to do is to sort a random array of numbers, swap them around until the whole thing is fully organized from one to the other. Okay. It works great, and computer science students have been studying this for I don't know 60 years or more. One of the things that we found, which apparently nobody had ever tried to do before, is that the algorithm itself assumes that the material is reliable. In other words, if you tell the 4 and the 10 to swap, that they swap. The algorithm has no provision whatsoever for checking whether did that in fact happen or didn't it. It just sort of proceeds. All of it assumes that the hardware is reliable and that what you say will actually happen. If you break that assumption and you make broken numbers that you tell it to move, well, it didn't move. It's broken. It's glued down. It's not going to move. The algorithm has no idea that happened. We don't change the algorithm. It had no provision for knowing that. What we find that in those cases, what the algorithm actually does is desort the string for a while in order to rearrange all the other numbers so that eventually it works. By desorting that string, if you look at how it's proceeding through the sorting space, it's going up and up and up and up, and then it hits the broken number and it goes down. It goes away from its goal. And then, boom, later that enables it to recoup gains later. The reason I'm telling you this story is that algorithm has zero provision for doing that. If you are looking for a mechanism or part of an algorithm that, well, how does it do that? It is nowhere in the thing you're looking at. It just isn't there. And yet it's there, and nobody had noticed for how many decades that it does that. So my point is just this. In order to understand this mapping between building something and having some of these behavioral capabilities and so forms of function as well as forms of structure, it is not at all, I think, like what we expect. I think that mapping is going to be way weirder, and you can build very minimal things that do not have an explicit observer, something you can put your finger on. Okay, that's the circuit that's doing future planning and path minimization, all that. There are systems that are extremely minimal that do this kind of stuff, and you will not find it in any obvious way in the algorithm or the materials. And so that's just, I think that project of figuring out the mapping is going to require us to break a lot of assumptions, but it's now tractable. We can, now that we know that that's what we're doing, we actually do this.
Okay, great. Remind me of the way even a photon, finds the least action pattern is something maybe hinted there in that comment. Yes. But let's go to Matt.
Let me try to be as brief as possible here and just highlight how important I think it is to maintain this metaphysical distinction between actuality and possibility, particularly when we're thinking about this morphospace, as Mike refers to it. And, John dropped the G word, and I think it's a word that has such a problematic history. Whitehead acknowledges that history in Process and Reality, but nonetheless finds it necessary to make reference to what he calls the primordial nature of God, which would be, that which orders the realm of possibility, because as the eternal objects, as he calls them, or the Platonic forms, they're not just randomly arrayed in that, in a kind of a soup of possibility. They all have definite relationships to one another, logical relationships, and even aesthetic relationships. And so when organisms are trying to make decisions in given circumstances and they're able to ingress novelty, Whitehead says, how is it that they can ingress relevant novelty, relevant possibilities? And God becomes the explanation in his metaphysics for where the order of those possibilities come from. But to think of the divine or the primordial nature of God in Whitehead's scheme as a kind of pre-established order, I think might be misleading, because we're not talking about an already actualized order. We're talking about a possible relationship among eternal objects. It's a possible order. It doesn't determine what happens, but it provides actualities, living organisms with an array of relevant possibilities to decide upon, to ingress. For Whitehead, the agency is all in the organism doing the ingressing, not in the eternal objects or the forms. And Mike and I have talked a bit about this, where the agency resides and so on. Very interesting metaphysical problem. But I think the key here is to recognize that the actual world is a community of organisms, but they're bathed in an ocean of possibility. And there's a great little section in Process and Reality in part 2 that I encourage every time I meet a Bayesian brain theorist or a free energy principle neuroscientist. I encourage them to read this, because in there Whitehead distinguishes between what he calls statistical judgments of probability, which is something like a Bayesian approach, and then there's a non-statistical form of probability, which Whitehead roots in a feeling of the intensive relevance of possibilities. And this intensive relevance has to do with the prehension of the primordial nature of God. It's not a statistical thing. It's not a Bayesian calculation. It's an aesthetic thing that links us to the divine, not as a creator of the world, but as I like to say, the relator of actuality to possibility, but also of the possibilities among themselves. So that's a lot of metaphysics condensed in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to throw it into the mix.
Great. I just want to, we'll take a question from Bobby, but Mike is leaving at noon. I told him we'd make sure that he is out of here. So he is absolutely, just click your button out of there, buddy, at noon. And so I want to create that hard boundary. We can hang around for a longer time than that, but that was the aforementioned agreed upon thing. So Bobby, you've had your hand up for a long time. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll make this question quick because it requires an answer from Mike, and I think it gets at this big point that Gregg was talking about as far as what would seem like a distinction between Gregg's model and Mike's, which is the same distinction that I've emphasized to Mike. We had a Twitter exchange a long time ago before we had met about this question of whether there's consciousness below brained organisms. And my model of that is that what brains do specially is that a genome can't do as a memory system is brains encode the causal consequences of our actions in real time. And therefore, the system that's modeling the world starts to build up a very precise model of itself as a causal agent. And that's what I think brings the observer into existence. It's the model doing the self-modeling. But what Mike's work shows, and these cellular processes that we can see, is that these simpler non-brain organisms might be doing self-modeling in a way complex enough to get recursive modeling, that if you believe this strange loop theory of Hofstadter inspired, that's what brings consciousness into the picture. So I want to ask Mike about that, but I want to quickly try to frame everything in a single paradigm that I think everybody's converging on. And it's interesting to see the order of presentation, because to me, it was the perfect laying out of the emergence of a new paradigm from a very experimental point of view. Then we got philosophy, then we got Bonnitta's thing that had both. And then we had John talking about how radical this is in God. And I want to say that's exactly the paradigm that I think is emerging. This influenced me through the work of Santa Fe Institute people, Harold Morowitz and Eric Smith. They are origin of life researchers who, Harold was my professor. I went to the Krasnow Institute. It was the sister institute of the Santa Fe Institute. It's where I got my PhD. So in their model, basically
Bobby, can I just get, we don't have a lot of time. So if there's a particular question, that'd be great. Or just wrap up, because I want to give Bard an opportunity.
Okay. So the question is, does Michael think that there's enough self-modeling to have consciousness that gives that plane in the UTOK thing below the brain plane? Can you get consciousness? But hold on one second. I'm just trying to get this point out. It's important. The whole paradigm that Bonnitta Roy was talking about with the global transitions, there's a model for this. It's a new, as John said, it's a new multi-level model of causation where there's causal emergence, and there's a mathematics for this already. It's the mathematics of phase transitions and cooperative effects, and that mathematics is equivalent to statistical inference. It's the mathematics of Bayesian inference, what Matt was just talking about, the Friston paradigm. I know Michael's buddies with these guys. So the systems that aren't alive, that are doing this self-organizing, intelligent thing, you can look at that as minimizing free energy gradient. And this is not just in systems that aren't alive, like dissipative structures. Our group is starting to, it's looking like the universe as a whole is doing free energy minimization, and that's the God function. We have a term that modifies the Schrodinger equation. So yeah, I'd like to hear their thoughts on that.
Great. Okay.
Thanks, Bobby. Okay, so in 60 seconds, I mean, obviously, I can't do all that justice, but I would just say, I don't like alive, not alive as a binary distinction. We could do hours on that. I don't like that at all. I get your point about the importance of building self models and world models and all that. When you say in real time, so we have a preference for things that occur in real time on our time scale. So one of the things you can do, you said the genome, and I'm not super into the genome anyway, but if you did want to talk about the genome, on longer time scales, the evolutionary lineage is absolutely on its real time, is that, which is of course much longer than our time, I think is absolutely making a model of itself and of its environment. And if you drop me an email, I'll send you a couple of recent things that we have on this, on how we think that's actually working. And I guess the last thing I'll just say, I mean, again, consciousness in 10 seconds, just that I don't believe any of these things make consciousness. I think evolution and other processes can make interfaces through which we can interact with various kinds of consciousness, but I don't think any of this makes consciousness from the beginning.
In the active inference,
okay, Alex,
yeah, we
need to go with Bard. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to refer to John first of all. Don't give up on dialectics, John. For God's sake, Desmond doesn't do dialectic. Hegel does. And I know you're going to end up with Hegel sooner or later, John, and then we can start talking about dialectics properly. Dialectics does not return to identity. Dialectics, it stays with the dichotomy. It stays with the continuity and the discretion. I mean, the conflict between discretion and continuity is a perfect example of dialectical deadlock. And the thing with dialectical deadlocks is that once we have a dialectical deadlock, we have a temporary truth. We have a temporary truth to build from. There are no permanent truths ever, at least not accessible to human beings. We have a temporary truth we can work from, and that's exactly what Hegel means with the dialectic. So then it jumps on and jumps on and jumps on. It never stops. And I don't think we can look at the world differently. You're the perfect example of it yourself. If you and I were sitting here arguing, then I would be accused of defending identity, and you would be suddenly, then I would have to accuse you being the exact opposite. So we would just end up in the same dialectical deadlock anyway. So back to dialectics. To me, dialectics is the way forward. I'll give you a perfect example of this. And Michael Levin actually agreed with me strongly. And that's about the word emergence. I think Michael summarized it when he said, emergence is just what we human beings predict onto history as far as we know it, where there was a surprise. Something really surprising happened. That's what emergence is. And that's why I claim that emergentism is a dialectical emergentism, has to be transcendental emergentism. That means that if something absolutely extraordinary happens, that means at least for us human beings, something shocking happened in history. Suddenly, biology was there. This entire session has been about biologism. It's been about, can we apply mind on biology? Fine. But then biology occurred, and biology wasn't chemistry, and biology wasn't physics. It was certainly something different. Whatever difference it was, we don't care. It's a projection. But projections work. The point with Hegel is that our entire lives, human beings, are filled with projections. So we project onto things through our subjectivity, project onto things, and give temporary truths if we're smart, apply temporary truths on different things around us. And that's the world we live in. And that's always going to be the world we live in. So you can then build an entire metaphysics, emergence vector theory, which is, by the way, identical to extended naturalism. We just think emergence, period. We don't even have categories like nature or culture. We just think emergence. And if we start thinking emergence, then we can have emergence vectors. For example, biology is an emergence vector coming out of the birth of biology. So the one thing I want to throw in here as a question is that the one word I haven't seen, if we're going to go from mind to consciousness, you've done mind well. I agree with Gregg. Mind is huge all over the place. But if you're going to go consciousness, which is much, much smaller as a category, then I throw the word in here that hasn't been used. Get the God word out of here. Bring in the word language. Language makes us distinct from other animals. Can we agree on that? And can we agree that if we don't learn language at a certain age, we become animalistic idiots the rest of our lives? So I want to throw language in here and have an approach towards language and consciousness, because I don't think we can speak about consciousness meaningfully without having language in here.